Good evening, colleagues. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. For coming tonight, in spite of the wonderful weather, maybe some of the beautiful evenings and days. But I think the subject is very interesting, and of course our guest, Ofer Zalzberg, whom I want really to welcome here tonight, is of an extreme interest. I can promise you. We had long discussions in Jerusalem at the beginning of this year, and his view and his vision is very broad, which is very necessary in dealing with the region. From the region itself, we have positive and negative news. Negative, of course, is at least what Mr. Netanyahu announced he would do if he would win. We will see if he will win and if he would succeed in doing what he is promising or threatening. We have some good news when Mr. Bolton has been sacked and Mr. Trump, at least in some way, would be ready to talk to Iran. Now it depends if Iran is ready to talk. Personally, I hope that irrespective of my dislike for Mr. Trump and irrespective of my criticism of some of the Iranian policy, I would like that the both would speak, because war and continuing crisis would be, I think, a disaster for the region. We have very mixed news from Yemen. The Emirates seem not to be too happy about the war as it is, but I don't know if separation of a part of Yemen would be, let's say, peaceful or a contribution to peace in that area. Anyway, it's very, very fluid what is happening there, with all the sometimes good news, but many bad news. And it is very good to have Ofer Zalzberg here from the crisis group, who will deal with Israel just some days before the election, and of course will deal also with the whole region. We're very happy that he is here, and he could only come because, especially Schleining and Gudrun Kramer is here, and will also say some words, was inviting him for other events. So we used this possibility, and of course, as we, Stephanie, myself, and Gudrun and others agreed, it would be very good to cooperate also in the future more, because peace is not something where we need a competition between different institutes, but it's something where we need cooperation and working together. And we're very grateful for this common outlook we have, and this event tonight is one of the signs or symbols also of our cooperation. Cooperation maybe, which could be helpful also for the whole development in the Middle East. Again, thank you very much for coming. Ofer Zalzberg will do some overview and some report, and then there will be an open and frank discussion. So he's prepared for that. So please don't refrain, but as always, we would like discussion and not some cold statements. But we are used here for open and frank discussion. Again, thank you very much, and I hand over to Gudrun.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hannes, and ladies and gentlemen. I also would like to welcome you on behalf of the Austrian Study Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm very excited that we have this event here today, mainly for two reasons. The first one is that I have been knowing Ofer now for 13 years, and what I understand about the Middle East, I owe a lot to the analytical skills of Ofer, and I always thought it would be great to have Ofer here in Vienna and to have this event here. So finally it happens after 13 years, so very happy. And I'm especially happy that it's also within the cooperation with the IIP, because we went together to Israel and Palestine in February, looked at the situation, and I think out of this really there came this desire that we should cooperate more, and this is now the first event, and I hope that many more will follow. I don't want to say anything about the Middle East or Israel-Palestine because I know that Ofer is much more interesting than I am. So I hand over to you, Stephanie. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this interesting evening tonight. Elections are upcoming in September, next week on Tuesday, so we are very on a short notice. It's a very actual topic. So thank you very much for coming, for you being interested in this important topic. Israel and Palestine, the conflict there, but also Israel in the region is something which is occupying not only ourselves but also like the whole international and regional security and prosperity since already 70 years, namely since Israel was found. Maybe just for the procedure, Mr. Ofer Zalzberg, who I'm going to introduce now in a second, will give a short introduction around 30 minutes where he will explain from his analytical point of view. He's not a representative of the government, so he's an analyst. He will, from his point of view, tell you what the ongoing conflicts are, what the main topics are at the moment. As you might know, in half an hour he will not be able to cover everything, so this is why we also have afterwards some space for a discussion, and I very much look forward to it. Just only very shortly, I also want to mention the Herbert C. Kehlmann Institute, which is also one of our cooperating partners, and it's represented by Wilfried Graf today. So thank you again, thanks to Gudrun. It is not possible without our colleagues actually to have such an event. However, my biggest thank, of course, goes to Ofer Zalzberg, who came here and who is available to speak to us, to speak with you tonight. And he's a senior analyst at the Crisis Group's Arab-Israel project since 2010 in Jerusalem. He covers the Israel-Palestinian conflict and also Israel's relations with its neighbors. He, by the way, furthermore also leads a religious peace-building work stream, which is not now the biggest topic we're going to talk about, but he's also affiliated with the Vienna-based Herbert C. Kehlmann Institute, which I already mentioned before. So welcome, Ofer. Thank you very much for coming. Maybe very shortly, I mean, all of you know that the conflict with Israel and Palestine since 70 years is crucial for the peace in the Middle East, and it's an international institute for peace. And so we really look forward what is happening there, what can be done, what are the possibilities for a future peace process. Also, is there a danger of war now in the Middle East? We have been discussing it in the last month with Iran and Israel and all the ongoing topics there. So I now hand over to you. Welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here, and I'm flattered and humbled by all of these generous introductions. And thank you to the IAP for hosting. We had a very pleasant conversation over breakfast in Jerusalem, and I'm delighted to continue here. And I'm glad to be here and as part of this long cooperation now for over a decade with my Viennese partners. And what I'd like to try to do in these 30 minutes is to speak mostly about what has been happening and is happening, and hopefully to open the conversation regarding the future as an exchange. Okay? And one of the reasons for this, as you know, is that prophecy was given to the fools, and I don't want to be the only fool in the room. So I'll be glad if we talk about the future jointly. As Stephanie said, the Israeli elections, it's very timely to discuss them now. And we are really approaching the ballot box. I want to just sketch to you what is happening in terms of who's against who and what is at stake. And I'll do it with broad brushes. It's impossible to touch upon all of the issues, and we'll delve into it later. As you surely know, the main competition is between, if you're here, then I imagine you know, the main competition is between two blocks. Netanyahu is leading the Likud party, a gentleman called Gantz, the former chief of staff of the Israeli army, is leading a party called Blue and White. And we have several other parties. The It seems that the kingmaker is going to be the former defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, who is leading a party of former immigrants from the former Soviet Union. We have ultra-Orthodox parties that in this election are firmly on the right. I'll explain in a second. National religious parties, who are mostly religious Zionists, very supportive of Israeli rule over the entire area of Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. And we have three parties on the left: the Labour Party, something called the Democratic Union, and the mostly Arab Joint List, where all of the Arab parties of Israel and one Jewish Arab party have united. In one last key party, it's called Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power, on the far right. And it's very important because whether it crosses the electoral threshold or not could decide who's the next Prime Minister. Because the results now are very roughly equally divided. We are seeing for months in the polls, and this is why we are going again to the polls in Israel, that there was a failure on both sides to establish a coalition just a few months ago. And compared to a few months ago, Netanyahu now is even less likely, according to the polls, to be able to establish a right-wing coalition. And we have basically three scenarios for these elections, for the results of these elections. The first one is a right-wing party, right-wing coalition with strong religious presence under the leadership of Netanyahu. The second one is that the results will not be clear and we will enter prolonged negotiations. Perhaps Netanyahu will try to establish a coalition, then the president will give a chance to Gantz, then again to Netanyahu. This could drag on for months. And the third one is that Mr. Gantz will lead the government, probably with the Likud, but the Likud without Netanyahu at the helm. And the prolonged negotiations could end in three main ways. One is that Netanyahu will convince blue and white to join him, and we will see a coalition made up of the two main center-right, center-left parties of Israel, with virtually no religious parties joining them, but Mr. Lieberman thrown in them. And this coalition is mostly, therefore, non-religious, tending more towards secular values. A second option is that Likud leaders will see that the only way to be Prime Minister is to get rid of Netanyahu, and they will rebel against him, so that Mr. Gantz will agree to be number 2 in command. And we are seeing signs of that, so far mostly by previous ministers in the Likud. And the third scenario is that blue and white, Mr. Gantz will establish a coalition, and the Likud will be within it. As you can hear, it's a very broad spectrum of options. And according to the polls, what I want to suggest is that the first and last options I've discussed, meaning a right-wing coalition led by Netanyahu, like the one that Israel has today, or a center-left coalition led by Gantz, both of them are much less likely, according to the polls today. So we are looking at Israel going towards some kind of power-sharing agreement, it seems, between the right and the centrists. And in this sense, to the extent that this is what will happen, it could trigger significant policy shifts, which I will lay out as I go on. And I'll just say that in the domestic perspective within Israel, we have increasingly the experience of a cultural war through these elections between the religious and non-religious parties. The religious are staking everything they can on a Netanyahu-led right-wing coalition, and I'm saying now both the ultra-Orthodox parties and the national religious ones. And the avowedly secular parties join hands with Gantz. The leader of one of them, Yair Lapid, has a rotation agreement with Gantz in case Gantz will be Prime Minister. So Israel is increasingly divided along this cleavage, and a new coalition is likely to exclude the religious parties. A new unity coalition, a new coalition that does some power sharing agreement, is more likely to build on the non-religious parties. This is quite a change from the last few years, where we've systematically had at least one major religious party. So what does it mean? What does it mean for policy? I'll point to three things, all of them relating primarily to the Jewish-Arab cleavage, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first one, domestically, I would say symbolically, Netanyahu is keen on moving ahead with what the current government has legislated, something called the nation-state law, which fixes Israel constitutionally almost as an ethnic nation-state with all kinds of privileges for Jews that go beyond an ethnic nation-state in the European sense, which also exists, of course, as a legitimate model. But for example, downgrading the status of the Arabic language, things like this. Whereas Gantz suggests to rectify the law, to continue with it, but to render it different so that Arab citizens of Israel, non-Jewish citizens of Israel will be equal. The second thing that you see, as was mentioned, is this question of the annexation pledge Netanyahu made. First, I will say that this annexation pledge, Netanyahu made it in a very conditional way. I would look at it, therefore, mostly as an electoral scheme rather than an actual statement of policy. He said clearly he would need a coalition in which all of the elements support this policy. This seems unlikely. For example, Mr. Lieberman is not keen on that. I'm far from certain that the ultra-Orthodox parties would like to see Israel annexing the West Bank and acquiring many non-Jewish citizens. And secondly, he said that this has to be done in coordination with the White House, and it's difficult to know what the White House will think in a month or less. And as I've told you, it's not even clear that Netanyahu will be Prime Minister. So this is with respect to the annexation, but more broadly, and the third point, really the dramatic difference, I would say, Netanyahu is trying to muddle through now for a decade and not to choose between the two major strategic options that Israel faces with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of them is to annex the West Bank with or without Gaza. In my view, it can only work with, and go for a so-called one-state scheme in which Palestinians receive citizenship. And the other option is to go towards separation, towards two states. And as we all know, Netanyahu is avoiding these two and is trying to carve space between the two and continue with a situation that is more in the gray zone. Gantz's policies, based on conversations with people close to him, and not so much based on his declarations, is basically to gradually create separation between Palestinians and Israelis towards a two-state reality. So this is really what is at stake from that perspective. As you saw in the title, I want to talk about three topics. This is the Israeli elections. The second one is the US plan, and I want to try and describe to you where I think the Americans are with this respect, and US-Israeli communication is with this respect, and I'll conclude with the mounting Israeli-Iranian tensions. The US peace plan, if you want to call it a peace plan, many people refuse this term, went through several stages and is not a fixed document. And it's, I would say, remarkable the degree to which US thinking has changed since Trump entered the White House on this issue. The first year or so of the administration, Jason Greenblatt, the Middle East envoy, was really had the lead. And the process was reliant much more on professionals from the NSC, from the State Department, mostly from the NSC. And basically had a two-step design. The first step, before immediately starting with negotiations, was to recreate conditions for negotiations, with the US orchestrating gestures and moves by both parties and by external parties, primarily the Arab Quartet, namely Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Jordan. So imagine a puppeteer trying to get Israel to do something and make a gesture towards Palestinians, Palestinians doing something towards Israel, Saudis doing something towards Israel, and so on and so forth, so that a new context in which a negotiation about a final status agreement or an ambitious agreement is plausible. Today it is not plausible. Today most Israelis and Palestinians are uninterested in the topic and view it as impossible. And the second stage of direct negotiations, bilateral between Israel and the Palestinians, the PLO, with the parallel Arab-Israeli talks with a regional horizon. Okay, so again, this Arab Quartet in Israel towards what is the region going overall, if there is Israeli-Palestinian peace. And a third process in parallel of state building of Palestine, with reliant on donations, international involvement, and so on. So this was the initial design, and Mr. Greenblatt encountered a lot of resistance from all sides to this. It became very difficult to advance in a rapid pace. Everyone wanted someone else to begin. Even small gestures were difficult to elicit. And basically President Trump became impatient and said, I want results in a faster pace. And the file moved for two reasons. It moved from Greenblatt to Mr. Kushner, Mr. Friedman, other people, senior advisors to the president and the US ambassador to Israel. And the move happened just in the end of 2017 when, as you all perhaps remember, the US recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and relocated its embassy to Israel to Jerusalem. And this reshaped the possibilities embedded within peacemaking. Certain things became much more difficult. Primarily, we saw a dramatic crisis in PLO-US relations. And President Trump did it mostly as an electoral move in order to win more votes in the midterm elections. And this had impact on policy. And President Trump received several proposals from his staff to do this, that is to say, to relocate the embassy, to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but to do it in a way that is accompanied by a gesture also towards Palestinians, that offsets some of the harm from a Palestinian point of view. The president rejected all of these offers, and we've seen a shift. We've seen a shift from trying to foster the conditions for negotiations, for negotiating compromise, to a policy aiming at coercing compromise, but primarily coercing the Palestinians into a compromise. And the substance of the plan also shifted. I spoke to you earlier about a plan which explicitly spoke about a Palestinian state, and this gradually eroded. And the same happened on other things. And the timing of publication of the plan shifted mostly according to the Israeli electoral agenda, okay, the timing. There was another thing that was changed as a result. In the earlier design, I told you, there was a great willingness to do also a regional level of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking between the Arab states and Israel. Mohammed bin Salman was willing initially to help in coercing Abbas into certain positions, is our understanding. And after the Jerusalem proclamation, this became impossible. King Salman in Saudi Arabia removed the file from the hands of Mohammed bin Salman and took it to himself. And basically the three main countries through which Saudi Arabia communicated with Ramallah, there was no longer direct communication, namely Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, began to reject all versions of the American plan, and nevertheless, the US continued with this line of thinking. And you saw already then that Mr. Greenblatt became unhappy and started to say that he misses his family and that he's losing money when he works for government and so on. And people who observed that were not surprised that he just resigned recently. So if you link these two issues, Israeli elections and where the Americans are in their thinking, after Israeli elections there are several possibilities. If Netanyahu is again Prime Minister, this most likely, the American plan most likely will be a tool to paint the Palestinians, the PLO, as rejectionists. It will be a plan that will offer Palestinians much less than international law indicates they should have, and much less than they believe is their minimum for an agreement. But the fact of them rejecting it and Israel in some vague way accepting it can help Israel, according to Netanyahu's thinking, in deflecting additional pressures for change. It could also help from Netanyahu's point of view in changing the consensus around Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. Two states according to the 67 line with two capitals in Jerusalem, certain ideas regarding Palestinian refugees, certain ideas regarding Israeli security, and to remold the conversation regarding Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking.
what Kushner and Netanyahu hoped it could do. They hoped to base an anti-Iranian coalition on the back of Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, even if the Palestinians reject, because there will be supposedly a plausible deal that Palestinians would reject, but Arab states would accept, Israel would accept, and they would be able to tell their publics, according to this logic, which I don't share, you see, all we need is for a sensible Palestinian leadership to come to power. For now, we agree with Israel on certain contours for an agreement, and therefore we can cooperate more overtly and publicly in our campaign against Iran. This will not happen. This, after the Jerusalem Proclamation, is impossible. So this is one scenario. Okay? The second scenario, is if Netanyahu has Gantz in government and they really share power in full decisions are taken jointly, let's say, or if Gantz is Prime Minister, then most probably the White House will go back to the drawing board and we'll see yet another new American plan, none of them so far published. And here the timeline is very significant. The likely scenario of a prolonged coalition formation could mean that is likely to mean that there is no Israeli government until December. Okay, we are now September, of course. December means 1 year, less than a year before US elections, in which, as you can see, President Trump is going to fight over each and every vote. You don't take risks when you go for elections. And a more balanced plan, which the White House would need if Gantz is part of the Israeli government or leading it, would not fly well with Christian evangelicals, with a certain constituency in the US that President Trump very much needs in order to be re-elected. I suspect that in such a scenario he will postpone publication of the plan and will go to the Christian evangelicals with one major asset in his hand. Look, I'm the first US president to recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel, rather than going to them with a plan that says we need to build a Palestinian state on the Holy Land promised by God to the Jews. Okay? So the US plan, in terms of our discussion today, is less timely. The timely is the Israeli elections, and the third topic, I think, is very timely as well. We really are in a period of mounting Israeli-Iranian tensions. And I'd like to point to why I think these tensions are increasing in the last few months, and what they mean. So basically we're seeing more and more Israeli-Iranian really direct exchange of blows, or through proxies, primarily since the US withdrew from the JCPOA, from the nuclear deal. And the US, with Israel's support, has, you know, put in place a so-called maximum pressure strategy, this campaign, to compel Iran to reduce its minimal demands. I say so-called because from Israel, what you see very clearly is that it's not maximum, is that the US is employing only economic levers, not military ones. Okay? And you see the same from Riyadh. It's using a very high economic pressure, and we see the results within Iranian society. And Trump seems to believe that the role of the US is to increase the economic costs, and if there will be a need in order to convince Iran to change policy, to use military power, this is the role of regional governments, Israel, Saudi Arabia, wherever it is. Now, the economic pressure increased significantly when the oil waivers were removed, and basically Iran is under increased sanctions. And Iran reacted as it said it would, both on the nuclear front, taking some actions that it refrained from taking, as you know, on enrichment and so on, and across the region. And I want to focus on the latter. Because in reaction to these things, when Israel saw more Shia militias just next to its boundaries, if it is in southern Syria, Lebanon, across Iraq, Israel reacted to them and ratcheted up its own strikes. In Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iraq, claiming, of course, that this is the Air Force of Liechtenstein. And for Israel, this is both a reaction to these increasingly frequent airstrikes, increasingly frequent attempts to attack Israel, if it is explosive drones, if it is the production of high-precision missiles, all kinds of either offensive steps or building offensive capacities in new ways. And And Israel is also guided very much by a desire to act against this kind of Iran-backed presence before US elections, while President Trump is still in the White House. US elections could see President Trump leaving the White House, which could mean Israel will have less of a free hand to act militarily. So we are seeing Iran and Israel really, when you go to the defense ministry in Israel, you hear more people starting to talk about the first Israeli-Iranian war. Okay? And we are seeing more recently two major changes. On the US side, we are seeing a shift with President Trump, where it seems that reaching the brink of conflict, of armed conflict between the US and Iran, made Trump recalculate course. You've read the reports about how the airplanes were already on the way and he reverses them. You see now how he fires Mr. Bolton, as Hannes mentioned, who advocated, of course, for a more aggressive line. And he's exploring a shift away from coercive diplomacy by leveraging coercive diplomacy and entering negotiations, notably, of course, through President Macron of France. And both in Jerusalem and in Riyadh, there is a fear of what they view as US betrayal, that in effect such a policy will lead a slightly better, again from a Saudi and Iranian point of view, JCPOA, a JCPOA plus, with slightly more stringent conditions with respect to Iranian nuclear enrichment, perhaps something on missiles, very modest, and the realization that even that will likely mean that Iran will get more than it got in the JCPOA. So this is a major shift, and the new Israeli government will have to deal with that. And broadly speaking, Mr. Gantz and Netanyahu view these things, it sounds like they view it similarly when you talk to them about policy. They view it very differently when you listen to them and you attempt a humble psychological analysis. And you see that on Mr. Netanyahu's side, there is a much deeper sense that Iran is an existential threat for Israel. And Mr. Gantz, I would say, is less colored by that. And I think that this could come to play a role in the future. It means that he could accept different kinds of diplomacy, especially if led by a US president, more easily than Netanyahu. So this is the first new recent change, which is why this discussion, I think, is timely. The second one is not in Washington, but in Moscow. In Moscow, I would say broadly, at least in my meetings and meetings of my colleagues in Moscow with officials, the Israeli-Iranian escalation is not viewed as highly problematic. Not in and of itself. A few Iranians, a few Israelis, casualties, whatever it is. But, and even more than this, there are some advantages to having Iran under pressure, especially in Syria. And this means that Russia can acquire there more influence, more contracts, more influence on the government in Damascus, and so on. As a result, Russia, which controls, I remind you, the Syrian airspace, for the most part turned a blind eye to Israeli attacks in Syria. In Lebanon also, where its capacities can also be relevant, anti-missile capacities, anti-aerial capacities. However, there are two things that are emerging now, two specific potential consequences of an Israeli-Iranian escalation that are viewed as a major problem in Moscow, and I'll conclude with these. The first is technical, and it pertains to the risk that these attacks, Israeli attacks, would lead to Russian fatalities. Okay? You have in Syrian skies, you have Russian airplanes, of course with Russian pilots. You have Russian soldiers on the ground, and you have more and more Russian mercenaries. And we've seen already one incident of a downing of a Russian airplane, which led to a dramatic crisis between Israel and Russia. And I think it would be wrong to underestimate how sensitive Russian public opinion is on this, and therefore how much it could limit Mr. Putin's freedom of maneuver and to continuing the cooperation he actually would like to have with Israel. So this is the first one, and also really very recently now Russian officials are complaining that Israel is no longer giving them enough advance warning before attacks in Syria. Okay, so you are really seeing that this is straining the technical, military, tactical cooperation between the two countries. The second concern is that this will lead to a major war between Israel and Hezbollah. And really, one which would involve possibly, perhaps likely, also Syria. So more and more in Israel, more and more in, if you talk to Hezbollah people, and in Syria, the next war between Israel and Hezbollah is defined, for example, by Israelis as the next northern war, not the next war with Hezbollah or Lebanon. As you know, Hezbollah is deployed also across Syria. It may be possible for them to fire from Syrian territory, and so on and so forth. Now, if a war, we were very close. We were the nearest we were in many years to a war just a few weeks ago. A war between Hezbollah and Israel. And a war could roll back, from Moscow's point of view, could roll back many of Russia's achievements in Syria of strengthening Assad's government, having a strong central government, which is their preferred, as you know, alternative. Because it could harm the military capacities of Assad, which could be taken out in such an exchange of fire. It would weaken Hezbollah, one of the most potent fighting forces helping Assad. Idlib, of course, is not yet resolved, the north of Syria. And during the Israeli-Hezbollah altercation just recently, the violence ended. There was a need to end the violence and not to go into a war. How do you do it when you are already firing at each other? When Israel attacks within Lebanon, okay, which Hezbollah said it will not tolerate. And just in terms of the diplomacy accompanied to it, I can tell you that Israel communicated with the Lebanese government through the US and France, but the communication with Hezbollah was through Russia, only through Russia. So you see how important Russia is. And this means that Moscow's role in preventing a major conflagration is of great importance. And as you perhaps know, Netanyahu will soon visit Sochi to meet Mr. Putin. This is not only aimed at boosting his chances at the ballot box, to show that he is a great leader on the international stage and so on. It is also to discuss Israel's expansion of strikes against Iran-backed targets in Syria, in Iraq, which is recent, and Russia's potential role in containing Israel-Hezbollah tensions. Okay? Mr. Netanyahu is not keen on seeing a war with Hezbollah. What he's looking for is to exert more and more pressure on Iran so that Iran will be more flexible as it negotiates a new deal. These are different things. So how is this related to Israeli elections? If Netanyahu will no longer be Israeli Prime Minister, and I'll just add, this could also be just a few months after Israeli elections, because even if Netanyahu is re-elected, he will face legal issues, as you know, which may force him to leave office. If Netanyahu is no longer Prime Minister, we will see that, at least if past is precedent, if you look at the last 20, 30 years, when a new Israeli Prime Minister comes to office, especially those who do not have military background, Israeli adversaries test the new person. Who is he? Maybe we should test, aggressively. Okay, maybe we can take advantage of his inexperience. So this is one issue, and it's a personal issue. So it doesn't matter if he will be replaced by someone from Likud or by Gantz or whatever it is. And second, also a personal issue, Netanyahu has a strong personal relationship, both with Mr. Trump and with Mr. Putin. Whoever will succeed him does not have that. In Mr. Putin's case, there is strong respect for Netanyahu. Right, wrong, doesn't matter. If there is someone else, a green person with less experience, who is viewed as... This could affect Israeli-Russian relations. So I've put in what I could on the table, as briefly as I can, hopefully confusing less and clarifying something. And I'll be very glad to have a conversation.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive, I would say, remarks on the different topics, on the internal, on the regional, and also on the international sphere. Maybe just 2-3 short questions from my side. You mentioned the two-state solution. You also have been talking about possible scenarios after the elections. Do you think, from your point of view, will the status quo firstly still stay there, or is the two-state, one homeland idea, is this also on the table? Is it discussed within Israel now in the pre-election? And maybe you can also very, very shortly and briefly say what is meant with this two-state, one homeland idea or concept.
Great. So I think you're asking two questions. I'll try to separate them a bit. One is, will the status quo continue? I'll add to your question, even if Netanyahu is elected, or when Netanyahu is elected, I told you that I find his promise to annex to be uncertain. It's now 10 years he's in office, even though Trump is in office more than 2 years, and so far he didn't annex a square centimeter. And when you talk to his advisors, you see that he is very cautious, and he would not like to give up on the possibility of Palestinian statehood and the possibility of separating from Palestinians. I think he sees clearly Israeli strategic interests. He's a very competent, experienced leader with a historical understanding of reality. So I don't think that he will do a dramatic annexation move, or that will dramatically change things, given his understanding of what this would mean in US public opinion, for example, in Congress, in Europe, in Arab states that would like to be Israeli allies. Some of them have already signed peace treaties with Israel. It will make it immensely difficult, if not impossible, for them to continue the treaties as they are now. Having said that, there are changes all the time. There is no status quo. A status quo, of course, is a term. And Israel has policy, Palestinians have policies, and in that sense, as you saw in the visit, things are dynamic. And one of the most imminent steps that will likely happen, no matter which Israeli coalition, for example, will come to power, is an attempt to redraw the borders, the Israeli borders of Jerusalem, in order to strengthen the Jewish majority within the city by removing from the city geographically those areas which have Palestinian majority, some areas like this. So there is this on a small scale. Small compared to your question about a formula, paradigmatic formula for resolving, in fact, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Stephanie is asking about new thinking in Israel and among Palestinians regarding different ways of doing two states, a two-state agreement, ways that most fundamentally are not based on a sharp separation. We are here, you are there, a big, happy, tall wall between the two, but rather porous borders, relatively free movement between the sides, obviously free trade agreement, and so on. And this thinking is so far mostly popular on the Palestinian side, which would like to have direct access to the Israeli labor market, and from an identity point of view, to all of its homeland. Palestinians view the entire land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River as their homeland, and they would like to visit, if it is Jaffa or Haifa. On the Israeli side, there is such a sense of wanting to visit also the areas of historic Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, but it's, I would say, less also for reasons of material interests. There is no economic interest in going to Nablus and so on. So these interests today, this kind of thinking is pioneering, I would say, today. I don't hear it at all still in government levels. But it is winning more and more support in civil society, in more progressive circles of civil society. And the main challenge it faces is, if we do two states in which the borders are porous, in which Jerusalem is a united, open city, in which in fact Palestinian refugees can all return anywhere in Israel and and reside there. If Jews, Israelis, will be able to live in the state of Palestine, across the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip, the main question Israelis at least are concerned about is, how do you defend one's national and religious identity when there is so much interaction? Is this not a risk to maintaining one's distinctiveness from an identity point of view? And I think this is the main reason that politicians are not picking up these ideas so far, As you know, because of globalization in many countries, we've discussed now Brexit, societies feel engulfed in a crisis of identity. And one of the challenges Israelis and Palestinians are facing is not only how to find terms for peace in the material sense of the word, only ensuring safety in the physical sense, but also how to design a reality in which they feel that they can prosper nationally and religiously.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting comment. Maybe if we go to the international level, I mean, you mentioned Russia. You mentioned that it is more important now. That it's interesting because Russia, unlike the other actors, international actors on the ground, they actually have been able to come to terms more or less with all the stakeholders there. So would you say that Russia, on the one hand, is now getting more important, also considering that the US is trying to get out of the region? I mean, we know that Trump always loudly says that he does not really want to get involved into the war. And I mean, we already mentioned John Bolton, and now with him, he was one person who was very much advocating for a war. So would you say that Russia is really gaining ground in comparison to the US?
Yes, yes, in the sense that, so first, the paradigm in Russia for the region, there are two competing paradigms for the regional security architecture of the Middle East. I'll unpack what I mean. As you rightly said, the Russians are trying to create and are aspiring to a regional security architecture in which all the countries of the region participate. All the countries, just to put an example, is both Turkey and Egypt, which, you know, one of them is led by Erdogan, who is very sympathetic to the Brotherhood, and in Cairo, the Brotherhood is largely in jail. Both Iran and Israel, which I've just discussed, and both the Saudis and Iran. So it's a very inclusive concept, and some criticize it for being unrealistic, because it tries to include everyone, in spite of the differences between them. And Russia would like to maintain strong relationships with all of these countries, and is working hard at it, not losing anyone. And indeed, I wouldn't say that the US is withdrawing from the Middle East. I think this is, those who say this are overstating what is happening, but as you rightly said, there is no desire for getting entangled in a war in the Middle East. Not Obama, not Trump, not the next US president. And that is very evident, and it's different. You see that Mr. Putin is ready to send airplanes and fight in Syria. And when the US is viewed as shying away from that almost at any cost, it has impact over its ability to project power in the region. The US paradigm for regional security architecture is limited to several countries. I've mentioned them before as part of the discussion about the US peace plan. So how to bring on board both Israel and Jordan and Egypt and some of the Gulf countries, mostly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, into a coalition that will go against an enemy of the US and an enemy of these countries, mostly Iran and their allies. So this is a sharp difference, and it's based on this that Middle Eastern countries are aligning themselves. Countries like, let's say, Qatar, Kuwait are trying to avoid making a decision. They wouldn't like to go with the American thing or all out with the Russian thing. So it depends, but broadly speaking, I think there is a major competition. You're putting your finger really on the most significant shaping dynamic from the perspective of international superpowers. My sense is that the US attempts, as many of you know, included a desire to create a Middle Eastern NATO, an Arab NATO, with or without Israel. And as we see, these are failing. There is no discussion anymore about what is called MESA. Even the Gulf countries among themselves, as we know, are caught up in a significant conflict. Qatar on the one hand, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates on the other, let alone bringing Israel overtly into this. So one of the problems of the US design is that the Middle Eastern allies of the US do not have a shared vision for the Middle East. They have a shared enemy, but not a shared vision. And it makes it more difficult to cooperate. You know who you are against. So let's say that somehow, just to explain my point, these countries managed to roll back Iranian presence from Syria, which so far they haven't fully succeeded in. What do they want Syria to be? What do they put in place of Iranian presence? Over this there is a disagreement. So if you only know what you are against, it's harder to advance. In Russia, I would say, on their side, they also have great weaknesses. Russia is willing to invest also militarily. They are taking risks. But, it's the 12th or 13th largest economy in the world. It's something the size of the Italian economy. There is a limit. It's not the US. There is a limit to their capacity, to their competency, to what they can invest, for example, economically in a country like Syria or Lebanon. And in that sense, their resources are very limited, and they can't hope to have the same kind of potential power like the US. And again, countries in the region know this. So Egypt is still mostly with the US, and when the US says not to buy certain things from Russia, it will not do so. The US exercises enormous economic power.
Thank you very much. Maybe also in this context, because it's interesting that we talk about Trump and about this ultimate peace plan. You talk about the role of Russia and whatever, but one very important external actor is actually missing, and that's the European Union. I mean, do you see any possibility for the European Union to engage in a positive way, or maybe probably even if it is just providing this vision which might be missing from the other countries? I mean, what is your stance at this one?
I'll add a bit to your question. I think that on the EU side, what we are seeing is enormous difficulty in reaching consensus, given the 28 positions. For now, 28, we'll see with the Brits. Having said that, I've mentioned, I think that President Macron's diplomacy may be transformative for the entire region, what he's doing. And we haven't seen others going and trying to really bring Iran and the US back to the negotiations table. It's too soon to say, but it's one of the most serious initiatives out there currently. So I think that sometimes the member states, currently primarily France, can, not Britain, and we have to see who will succeed Ms. Merkel, can act, can punch high, and there is a need for that. Russia and the US are on, I'm trying to recall when relations between Russia and the US were so bad, and you have to go back to many years. They can't even communicate directly on many issues. And Europe is very necessary, if it is Europe or if it is European states. So from that point of view, I think there is real potential when we talked about the broader scheme. When you look at fostering a regional security architecture, I'm not aware of a clear EU position on that, which is unfortunate, I would say. I think the EU has a lot of technical competence in thinking about regional frameworks. And maybe it seems overly ambitious, I don't know, but I think that but the countries need this, and they need, this is a gradual process. Of course, only if we look at the EU, we see this, how it starts with coal and steel and very gradually goes beyond. We are seeing now, I think, a very interesting cooperation, even between Iran and Saudi Arabia, in terms of maritime trade and the freedom of boats to travel freely, primarily the Straits of Hormuz. So you see that even in times like today, such things are popping up. There are some shared interests even in times of conflict, and we are seeing that most of the governments are looking at how to manage this conflict without it erupting into a full-fledged war. So I think that putting in place the seeds for future regional institutions is very significant, and is something in which Europe could contribute. But this is not to say that it will be a magic wand. It's a very slow, gradual step.
Yeah, we will see then what happens once the commission and everything is done, finally done.
Yes.
Another question, I mean, you also mentioned the JCPOA, you mentioned that Bibi Netanyahu sees it as an existential threat to Iran and the JCPOA, but what about Saudi Arabia? Isn't Israel worried about plans of nuclear proliferation of Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Israel can say very frankly, and is trying to do it as loudly as possible, to say that it is terrified about an Iranian nuclear weapon. But Israeli leaders feel very uncomfortable to say, frankly, just how worried they are about Saudi nuclear weapons. I'm not government, so I have the privilege. There are several issues here. One is a concern about nuclear arms race in the Middle East, which extends even beyond Saudi Arabia. And we are already hearing rhetorical statements from the Turks, sometimes from the Egyptians. This is very dramatic if more and more countries even will just aspire to have nuclear weapons. Second, this is much more important. Anyway, okay, this is one. Two, in Israel, the way that thinking is shaped around this is that this is precisely why the Iranian quest for nuclear weapons should be stopped, so that the Saudis will not feel a greater need to have nuclear weapons, and then the Turks will feel a need to have nuclear weapons, and then the Egyptians, and so on. So there are really significant things at stake when we are looking at nuclear weapons, and as you perhaps know, some of you, there were scholars who thought that sometimes it's better to give to a few more countries nuclear weapons because it will introduce a certain balance. I'm not keen on, there is, my basic intuition is that there is already too much nuclear weapons around. In Israel, there is, currently it's already over a year that there are talks between Israel and the US on this issue. President Trump is inclined to sell, in this case to the Saudis, as much as possible, but to many governments. And the reason that it's very difficult for Israel, and we see some erosion in the Israeli position during these negotiations, so Israel says, do not do it no matter what. And the US answer is, look, if we won't sell them nuclear capacities for enrichment here, of course not, we're not talking about nuclear weapons, someone else will. How do we prevent? The most important alternative is South Korean reactors. And they will get South Korean reactors, it will cost them less. It's hard for us to convince them to buy US reactors, which are more expensive, And if they buy the US reactors, they come with all kinds of strings attached, much more than if they buy them from South Korea or other alternatives. So it's really a question of a market, of a price and alternatives and what is the product and so on. And Israel is trying very much, not only to affect therefore the US, but also South Korea and other possible providers of such technologies. And the jury is still out on how successful it will be.
Thank you very much. I think we can go now to the discussion with the audience. So
that's it. We did everything.
Yeah, I guess, and I'm pretty sure there will be more questions. And so, is there any question in the audience? Yes, we have one over there. We can probably collect 2 or 3 questions and
yeah.
Well, I have problems understanding the Iranian position.
Yes.
It seems it is clear for me that Iran provokes Israel. There are provocations. And I wonder, what can they win by that? Mm-hmm. What is the logic behind the behavior of the Iranians? What can they win by a conflict with Israel, or by this conflict with Israel?
Mm-hmm. And there's another one.
Thank you. Israel is apparently acting as a Russian proxy by attacking Iranian targets in Syria and those of Iranian allies in Lebanon and now recently in Iraq also, which drives these affected parties closer to Russia. For example, now in Iraq, the negotiations are going on to purchase Russian S-400 missile system. So, what is the gain for Israel by serving Russia in this issue? Because the Russians are main beneficiaries of these Israeli attacks. Thank you.
No more for them? Okay, one more we take for now. We can have then a second round, of course.
I would like to ask a question connected with the history of Israeli thinking, which seems to come up after many decades. On the one hand, the Brit Shalom idea of the peace group of Henrietta Salt and her companions, and on the other hand, considering that Netanyahu's father was secretary of Jabotinsky, how is the idea that there is an iron wall necessary and everything will be separated and okay? Are these things in Israeli thinking present or not at all?
We have one more in front of you here. No?
Thank you very much. You spoke about the lack of a strategy and kind of forward planning, priority planning, also in terms of the Israeli government and politics. But I'm wondering if you can say something already about the PLO. And by that I mean is if there are no good ideas around there how to solve this issue. Having been for a long time in negotiations myself, I know that just to persist in reiterating your viewpoint, you're not going to get anywhere. And I'm also missing a lot of creative thinking on the part of the PLO, aggravated, of course, by the fact that you have the split with Hamas. So I don't know exactly how you see that, or whether you think that there's a way that there could be a motivation, or maybe some prompting about some creative thinking about how...
Some
creative thinking or motivation in terms of, just not only dangling, let's say, an economic reward, but it has to be also a political reward for that side.
Thank you. I think you can already start to answer. It's already many questions.
Yeah.
Even though we answered all of those before. Not totally.
No. Okay, so the first and second questions are about why the Iranians are attacking and when the Israelis are attacking, I think, and what do both parties hope to achieve in this. These are very good questions. Because usually in these discussions we just go into tactics, who does what rather than why. My understanding of the Iranian strategy in this is to demonstrate primarily to the US that coercive measures against Iran have a cost in and of themselves, and the cost is felt by US allies. And therefore, the US should not continue on this path, but go into negotiations. And we've seen this with attacks against all kinds of tankers in the Gulf area. We've seen this with missiles landing in Saudi Arabia. And we are seeing this with these attacks that are imminent against Israel, and then Israel blocks them or other things. And this all of these reports do go to the Pentagon, and the US does take this into account. And I think that President Trump is not only concerned about what happens if the US strikes in Iran, but indeed an Israel-Hezbollah war can draw the US into complex dynamics, especially, and we are seeing it even more clearly when the Israel is striking in Iraq. That is very significant for US national interests in the Middle East. So Iran is, for example, signaling that it could also cause problems to the US in Iraq and so on, in order to get the US to change course. And I believe that there are people now in Iran who feel that this tactic has been effective and is part of what made President Trump explore a shift away from coercive diplomacy to negotiation. Israel indeed sometimes is in line with Russian interests when it attacks these Iranian or Iranian-backed targets. But it also, as I tried to suggest, sometimes is at odds with Russian interests. It's a complex relationship. Russia is trying to establish Assad as a strong government in Syria, and when every month or so, sometimes more often, there are reports about foreign air forces operating in Syria, violating Syrian sovereignty, it doesn't help Assad tell his people that the war is over, that we can restore foreign investments. It's hard to convince investors to do this. These are things Russia also would have liked to see. But the basic interest of Israel, thinking through military lenses mostly, is to prevent two specific things. One is to prevent Iran from establishing high precision capacities next to Israel borders, rockets, missiles that can strike in Tel Aviv, in Ben Gurion Airport and elsewhere, strategic targets, Israel's gas rigs. And this can cause great harm to Israel, and already there are some such rockets, but if there will be a greater amount, it will be dramatic. And this is the second priority, national priority, and strategic priority of security in Israel. The first one is preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And the second issue is to prevent an establishment of militias in Syria, so that is to say next to additional Israeli borders, beyond the occupied Golan in this case, from which it will become very difficult for Israel to deter attacks. This is the case today in Lebanon. Hezbollah can operate in Lebanon. And Israel is extremely concerned that Syria will go through a process of fragmentation, when the central government will not only be weak, but there will be active militias backed by Iran and able to strike at Israeli civilians and soldiers as soon as they want with very low costs. So Israel is trying to contain these two efforts militarily, and indeed there is sometimes an overlap of interest between Israel and Russia.
Yeah, the question was that these attacks serve the Russian interests.
Yes.
What does Israel get from Russia in return?
I see, sorry. Israel gets from Russia in return the freedom to do these things. Yes, you're right. And it embarrasses Russia, because if you will see, it complicates Russia's relationship with Iran in particular. Yes. Sorry, now I understand. On the history of Israeli strategy, both in ideological terms, really, as you put it, and strategically, I think that there are two shifts. One is really the Likud is shifting, and the Likud, Netanyahu still sticks to the iron wall thinking, broadly speaking, but Likud is decreasingly the party of revisionist Zionism and is increasingly the party of religious Zionism, of Rabbi Kook rather than of Vladimir Jabotinsky. And if you look 10 years ahead, 20 years ahead, 5 years ahead, if you look already today at the degree to which Likud MKs and ministers need to demonstrate very palpably their commitment to settlements in order to be re-elected, this is because so many of the Likud members today are religious Zionists who, for theological reasons, are committed to settling, peopling the land. And I would say that Gantz is not far from the iron wall notion. He doesn't think that his strategy will lead to a defeat of Palestinians, but he wants to prevent another risk in parallel of losing the possibility of a Palestinian state. But I think he also is of the view that Palestinians are currently not ripe for negotiating a final status solution, are not willing to make the necessary compromises, and that the best way to make them undergo this shift is demonstrating that Israel cannot be defeated militarily. On the PLO and Palestinians' creative strategic thinking, I think it's a great question. And I share the broad sense that PLO thinking is somewhat stale. And you hear it a lot from younger Palestinians, this criticism. But the younger Palestinians, those in their 20s and 30s, are proposing alternatives that are more that are not strategic, in fact. They are more about, we need to go for individual rights. How do you go about making that happen? How do you... So I think there is a lack of robust strategic thinking. I think that the main thing that the PLO could do, which sounds maybe very cliche, is it needs to re-engage in direct conversations with different kinds of Israelis in order to better understand how Israelis understand the conflict and social life in general. I think that there is a very poor understanding, in fact, among PLO leaders, including those who have negotiated for years with Israelis, because they've negotiated usually with a very specific type of Israelis, labor Zionism, and they fail to understand the Israelis that are now in power. If it is revisionist Zionism or religious Zionism, ultra-Orthodoxy, Israeli society is very composite and complex. You use the term motivations. There are very different motivations for each of these groups, and I think that it will be very important for the PLO to better understand these motivations and look for strategies that can address these motivations. If it found a way to bring Hamas on board, it may perhaps counterintuitively be easier. Hamas, like religious Zionism, comes with a religious understanding of the conflict, and peacemaking has to find a way to make space for this. It cannot be, at least in societies like the Israeli society, Palestinian society, in 2020 and beyond, one cannot continue with secular peacemaking and pretend that people will keep their religious beliefs to themselves and they will not be part of politics. This is, I think, no longer the case, if it ever was. And I think that Hamas may be better equipped for such kind of conversation than the PLO. This, of course, requires a parallel attitude on the Israeli side, exploring, probing where is Hamas, and not only where is the PLO, and viewing Hamas not only as an adversary of peacemaking, but potentially, this is something to explore, also as part of a peace agreement. One of the major differences, just to make it more concrete, the secular paradigm looks at a final status agreement in which the parties agree on end of claims, end of conflict, a kind of harmonious resolution of the conflict. The religious parties, especially the national religious parties, are viewing this radically differently. They are praying every day that all of the land will be theirs. They cannot say that there is an end of claims. It goes against their belief. They need to find a way to do peace which keeps these messianic horizons open. This is just one example on how I think that there is a need to shift from secular peacemaking to a kind of peacemaking that is more hybrid, that allows both secular people and religious ones to feel part of that new peace.
Thank you very much. We have another question here in front, please.
Yes, just your last comment on Hamas. It's a little bit ridiculous because there are ongoing negotiation contacts between Israel and Hamas permanently.
Yes.
On the other side, especially Israel on the political level say no at all, no contacts and no acceptance, political acceptance of Hamas. So this is a game. But I'm with you. I think on the Palestinian side, for sure, a unity is a very important condition. First, it would make Fatah a little bit younger and a little bit modern. And secondly, it would try to unify even politically the Palestinian side. But Israel is playing an unfair game in that sense. So this has to be clearly stated. The second, at the beginning you were mentioning two main blocks. I don't see two main blocks, frankly, and will put it in a specific question on this annexation plan. As I know that even Benny Gantz didn't say no. Today there is a very provocative article of Gideon Levy in Haaretz about that. And What reminds me, because the annexation, this is nothing new. I think this is, in fact, the old Allon plan, yeah? Which comes from the Labour Party. And this is something which brings me to the political situation in Israel. I think there is an old revisionist camp in my views and an old secular Labour Party camp. First, the Labour Party has gone, 6 seats in the parliament in the last elections, and now together with Meretz they will be lucky to get 5. So the left, the old traditional left camp in Israel is also gone. And what you said to about the Palestinian young people is the same on the Israeli young people. Go to Tel Aviv on Saturday night and you see almost identical ideas you find in Ramallah at night with the young Palestinians, because they are fed up of their leaders. They are fed up of a political position which brings both people to nothing. And therefore my question, even Gideon Levy refers to David, what about the one-state solution? Because everything, you said the religious from both sides, the Islamist religious, they are dreaming from their homeland, which is till the Jordan at least, and the Zionists the same. So they are preaching and dreaming of the same homeland. So there is only I know it's not practical, but they are talking about the same land, so there is only one solution. The one-state solution, which is discussed on both sides in circles, and this should be done, put in an official discussion on the political level.
Thank you very much. There is another question there from Hannes, and then in the back. And then
Thank you. Just briefly to this idea. Of course, it's an idea. It would be an ideal situation, but I think we cannot forget about the searching for identity in both the Jews, but also with the Palestinians. One remark I want to say to your definition or your critical position towards the one homeland and two-state solution is, this does not imply automatically that every Palestinian can return and can take a footing in Israel, because you can also have it in a situation that you limit that. Yes. Just to mention, there are very different differentiation. You can have two states, but some common authorities, like a common human rights code, a common water agency and so on. So I think there are many differentiations, but that's just an additional remark. I have two questions. The one question would be on Syria. We had recently an expert from Lebanon here who was just of the opinion that a very weak Assad regime, and it will stay weak and very much dependent on Russia and on Iran. But the two are already competing economically and politically influenced. So what is your, because you mentioned that Russia is interested in establishing a strong Assad regime. Is it really interesting in establishing an Assad regime, which of course can govern, but which is finally dependent and stays dependent on Russia? So maybe you can analyze that. And maybe you can have a word on Yemen, because, also in your name, because, there was perhaps a bit misunderstanding that the Emirates will withdraw. There was then the information that the Emirates may fight for a separation of some parts of the Yemen. Then there are some discussion, there are some information that Saudi Arabia even is starting to have some limited or starting some peace talks. What's your opinion how things will develop in Yemen?
We have another question there in the back. Yeah.
I want to commend the IAP for this meeting and also the very comprehensive presentation. in this intellectual community, we have not to shy to draw the curtain and see the reality. You have never talked, you didn't touch upon the issue of the source, root cause of the whole problem, which is occupation based on religion. It was not occupation by land. Therefore, I'm sure that you never find any solution with Israeli-Arab. It's not a conflict of the borders. It is a religious, in-depth religious commitment of three divine religions. We have given the suggestion, apart from this propaganda against Iran, our leader gave about 25 years ago or more, I said it in Vienna or different forums in the world, I quoted, he suggested the only solution, as it was just commented by our distinguished friend, is one-state solution, a democratic referendum under the UN auspices, Christian and Jews and Muslims all participate, even those who have come and occupied. Since they're living there, we have to be cope ourselves with the reality. Everybody there could join a democratic process and we put an end. And this is a mistake to assume that solving the problem. For 50 years, this mistake is done. I was in the US about 50 years ago in a conference, and one of the PLOs was giving a lecture. I just participated. He said, hopefully Arab-Israelis peace treaty, it will work. I raised my hand. I was a young man. I said, it won't work because it is not the problem of Arabs, a problem of Muslims, of the whole world, and a problem of humanity, because occupation on the basis of a religion. And this is a very difficult, very dangerous phenomenon. Other religions could do to other part of the world. Therefore, I don't want to give a comment because I was asked to know. But what is your opinion about this proposal of one-state solution through democratic referendum? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please, many more questions.
Yeah. Okay, so first there was a question about whether there is an unfair Israeli game when Israel does it negotiate with Hamas and at the same time marks it as entirely illegitimate. I think that this is internally consistent, meaning Israel really thinks that Hamas is not a partner for a final status agreement or a full agreement, and therefore is limiting itself to what it thinks it can be a partner for, which is in effect security coordination. And broadly speaking, the Israeli attitude towards the PLO is the same. Netanyahu thinks that the PLO is not a partner for final status negotiations and is only doing security coordination with it. Whether he's right or not is, I would say, complex. I don't see, I have to say, at the top of the PLO, a willingness to deal with the right of return, specifically, in a way that can be reconciled with the Zionist narrative, including the remnants of the Zionist left. And it's not a coincidence that even labor governments failed to do it. So I think that it is more complex, let alone when you take also Hamas's religious worldview. Let alone when you take Israel's religious worldview. So I think that there is a pragmatic, sort of speak, attempt to deal with adversaries without going to an all-out war. On both sides, Hamas decides to coordinate on security with Israel and so on. It's very far from what I think should happen. I think the reality in Gaza is shameful. I think that there are many things Israel should allow in and it doesn't. And I think that Hamas, it's shameful that it does not even consider certain ideological change in order to improve the situation in Gaza. I think that the leaders on both sides do not put human beings at the center. Second, are there two blocks or not? I don't disagree with you that the difference between them is not huge. There are two blocks, if only in the simple sense that you see them competing with each other. I think that Gudrun Levy fell into Mr. Gantz's spin. Mr. Gantz does not want to annex the West Bank, freaks out if he hears this. It does not want 2.5 million Palestinians as Israeli citizens, does not want to allocate Israeli budget to them, and does not want to risk a Jewish majority in Israel. He's not at all there. He says that he wants to keep the Jordan Valley forever. I'm convinced, based on meetings I've held, that we should not read this as a pledge of policy. And I've mentioned a few concrete policy differences, if it is about the nationality law, and I can give you a few examples, and I very much acknowledge that the difference is not enormous. However, I do not assess that a so-called one-state solution is possible, and this is to both of you gentlemen, and of course I acknowledge I may be wrong. I'm just sharing with you my view, respectfully. The reason is the following. Identity matters enormously, including, as you rightly say, sir, theology. And I don't see two things. Even if I take your question first in the pragmatic sense, not judging it normatively, I mean, who is going to force these people to abandon their religious beliefs and to go into a democratic state in which their religious aspirations are not fulfilled? You pointed out that the secular camp in Israel is on the decline. So I think that we need to look at these societies increasingly as societies that are influenced, shaped by religion, and we have no choice, even if whether we like it or not, but to think through the prism of religion how to do peace. Not only religion, not exclusively religion, not fundamentalist interpretations of religion, many caveats. But I don't see how one can just discard religious understandings. And I think you're absolutely right that when you say that the core is Jewish theology, in terms of the first settlements in the West Bank, were clearly done by religious Zionists. And this was a theological project. So please don't get me wrong. I think that your analysis of the cause I share, okay? At least with respect to the settlements in the West Bank. And the fact that they share the same Holy Land, the same understanding of the Holy Land, the same homeland, is insufficient because their theologies guide them from this premise to totally different conclusions. Because it is my Holy Land, it should be ruled only by myself, because I'm the only one who can ensure that the sanctity of the land will be respected. So he wants an Islamic state, he wants a Jewish theocracy, and they cannot agree on how to do a one state. They have totally... they are very much at odds, entirely at odds, in terms of how to distribute power. And they are not looking at how to share power because it goes against their theologies as they presently are. Hannes very rightly pointed out, I should have said this, I'm very glad you said it. Two homeland, one state, and all of these paradigms absolutely can be different. I was just referring to the thinking as it is. I think you are right, and I think that this is a very promising direction. I think that going for two states based on sharp separation would be a mistake. It makes it even more difficult to get to a two-state reality. We need borders to be as porous as possible, and to the extent that one can also, through these additional freedoms, address needs, including identity needs of the sides, I'm all for it, and I just think that the people who do it need, as your first comment suggested, take also identity seriously. Syria is weak, and as your Lebanese counterpart mentioned, yes, I think that Russia wants a Syria that is both strong and dependent on Moscow. And they feel they had that. Strong means something very specific. Strong means that it has full control over everything happening within that territory. But if you look at it globally, it doesn't mean it's strong in comparison to, let's say, Israel. It still needs, therefore, the backing of a country like Russia. So I think they would like very much to return. I know when you sit to the people at the top, they are nostalgic about Assad the father, and they want Assad the son to return to the same thing, where they can pick up the phone to one strong man and things get done in Syria or in Egypt or in Iraq. And they remember their conversations with Saddam and with Mubarak, and they want someone else to do it with. And that's the Russian vision, because they don't see that democratization in the Arab world is possible. Their lesson from the so-called Arab Spring is that it's premature, you need a different kind of economy, a different kind of societal institutions, all of this analysis which we can discuss.
Even premature in Russia itself. So.
I fully agree, and they think it's premature in Russia itself, even though they put up a show. The short version is exactly that there is no any kind of Western democracy in Russia, of course. On Yemen, it's I think that all of these reports about the UAE withdrawing and supporting separatists and so on, I think this is overstated. But I think that in the UAE there is indeed a different vision. As you know, unlike the Saudis, fundamentally the main enemy of if you make a list, who is the worst in the Emirates or in Saudi? In Saudi, number one is Iran. In the Emirates, number one is the Brotherhood. And this shapes a lot of things about where we should invest or not. And I think that this strategic difference is coming to the fore, also in Yemen. I think that they are only diluting their presence. They don't feel that they should abandon it altogether, but they think that the Saudis are too stubborn, especially Mohammed bin Salman, and they would like to create room for a change. And I think that this room is slowly opening up. We're seeing the Houthis, in fact, gaining in strength. But I wouldn't risk a prophecy. I don't know what will happen, and my sense is that this is not at all about to end, and I think that the Yemenis are one of the people who are suffering the most in the Middle East and will continue, sadly, to be in this situation. And lastly, I touched upon, I think this is...
All right, thank you very much, Ofer. I think I can leave you here. It was very, very interesting. I think you touched upon very important issues about the importance of identity, about the psychological barriers also in this very, very long-lasting conflict internally, but also on spoilers on all sides, like be it within Israel, but also be it in the region. We talked about external actors. But also we talked about promising concepts, maybe just we need to find different ways of thinking, different ways of finding a solution maybe, even though it's not going to come maybe next year or in the upcoming month, but we need fresh ideas probably and not stick to the old concepts which obviously seem not to work and which obviously also failed one very important issue, namely that they totally failed to create somehow a narrative where all parties involved would actually understand that they would gain from peace in a long term. I mean, they would gain normalization, they would gain freedom, they would gain international recognition, and I think it is very important that we keep on analyzing what is going on the ground and on there. And I think it was very interesting. Thank you very much for coming. I enjoyed it. I learned also a lot myself. Thank you very much for your contributions, for you being here, for being interested in this topic. It's also of our concern. The Middle East seems to be far away, but everyone knows in a globalized world, everything is interconnected and we cannot keep out of it. So now I wish you a very nice evening. We will invite you to a glass of wine still if you want to discuss. I hope you will stick around for some more minutes. And I was going to say a big applause for your efforts, but thank you very much. And thank you to our partners as well.
Thank you for coming and for your questions and comments.